I think that was far and away the most rousing introduction for the Interagency Panel that I've ever seen. So thank you, Tagali.
You made it. Great.
He is right, though, that we really have a even more stellar panel this year than we have had in past years, primarily because we now have kind of a sanctions end of the table to go complement our export control side of the table. But I thought I would give a quick introduction, have a few data points for you, and then we're going to get right into our speakers. And we want to make sure that we allow some time for questions and answers, because typically we get far more questions for this panel than we have time to answer. So we want to make sure we allow time to at least answer some of them, and hopefully give you answers that you can understand. As many of you know, Beth McCormick has been a participant on this panel for many years. She is currently the director of the Defense Technology Security Administration at the Department of Defense. She is one of now, I would say, three of the panel members who have also spent time in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. So this is really nice synergy here. Again, Beth will tell you more about, of course, what DITSA does for those of you who don't know or not that familiar. But clearly, DITSA is an integral part of the export control system, both in terms of what's controlled, the policies that we apply, and then the adjudication of individual transactions, whether they're license applications or commodity jurisdictions. So Beth and her team at DITSA are an integral part of that. Then next to her, Brian Nielsen is the newly minted Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense Trade Controls at the Bureau of Political Military Affairs at the State Department. And as I'm sure many of you know, I think Brian is probably maybe the only person in history who has the trifecta of working at DETC, the NSC on export controls. He just finished an 8-year stint there. And of course, as you heard yesterday, was integral in the development and implementation of the export control reform, the President's initiative. But of course, he had a long career at Commerce before that, as operating committee chair in the Foreign Policy Division, all sorts of different responsibilities. So it's terrific to have Brian here on the panel. Next to him, Andrew Keller is Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Economic and Business Bureau at the Department of State. EB is a new participant on the panel, but certainly not a new participant in the export control process. They, along with the Bureau of International Non-Proliferation and International Security, review a lot of the commerce licenses and, of course, are integral in the development of implementation of U.S. sanctions policies. So it's terrific to have Andrew here. And Ganser, you know, has been here for many of these sessions. She is the director of the Office of Conventional Arms Threat Reduction in the Bureau of Non-Proliferation and International Security at Department of State. And of course, they're responsible for all the multilateral regimes. So she, in fact, is going to lead off after I stop, because the multilateral export control regimes are the basis of our export control system. And then last but not least, we're also pleased to have John Smith, who is the acting director of the Office of Foreign Assets Control, Department of Treasury, who will, of course, talk to you about what OFAC does generally, and I think specifically on some of the current programs of interest, Iran, Cuba, Russia. So we've got a great lineup. Just a couple data points for context for what you'll hear. In calendar year 14, there were about $1.6 trillion in exports from the United States. So $1.6 trillion worth of exports from the United States. 1.5 trillion of those essentially went no license required. So you're talking about $100 billion of exports from the United States in calendar year 14 that had to go under either an individual license or some kind of license exception or exemption. So again, that's to give you overall context that the vast majority of trade is certainly not impacted by license requirements from the export control system. Of that 100 billion that went under license or license exception, roughly 35 billion of that were USML exports, about 16 billion of that were EAR exports, and of those, about 12 billion were crude oil. So you can see on the EAR side, the amount of trade that actually goes under a commerce license, relatively speaking, is pretty small. About 40 billion of that went under license exceptions on our side or license exemptions on the state side. A couple other data points in terms of commerce licensing. Of course, our numbers have been going up dramatically because of the transfer of all of the now 600 series items from the USML to the CCL. So last year, we at BIS processed about 37,000 license applications in an average processing time of just under 22 days, which is a real testament to the interagency review process, because remember, all of our licenses basically go to defense, state, and a fair amount go to energy for review in that first 30-day period. 400 of those cases went to the operating committee and 16 went to the ASAP. So you can see the vast majority of export license applications that come into commerce get approved interagency in that first 30-day review period. Two other data points, and then we'll turn to Ann. Again, I think as you heard yesterday, strategic trade authorization exports, since its inception in July of 2011, there have been about $1.2 billion worth of exports under strategic trade authorization license exception. About 20,000 individual transactions and 622 companies, different companies have used STA. So I think that shows you that this is working as we intended. We really wanted to take those easier, less sensitive exports out of the license review process and rely more on the exporters to comply with the terms of STA. The other thing that's really interesting, and I think Kevin Wolf mentioned this yesterday, even though our licensing load has gone up to 37,000 and we anticipate it'll be well into the 40,000s next year, the number of CJs that we have processed has been fairly constant, about 1,000. The number of CCATs, commodity classifications, that we have processed has also been fairly constant, roughly 5,000 a year. So I think what that shows is that the changes we've made, especially on the USML side, have worked as intended in that they've made things much clearer, both from a jurisdictional viewpoint and a classification viewpoint. So we're pleased that the CJs and the CCATs have not gone up proportionally as the license applications coming to us have gone up. So with that, let me stop and ask Ann to come up and give you an overview of the international architecture for the export control system.
Thank you, Matt. And I'd like to thank Undersecretary Hirschhorn for hosting this year's event and inviting me to participate in this discussion. Update is probably my favorite event every year, so I'm always glad to be here. So I do thank you for that. Speech written by a committee.
Well, good morning, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Matt, thanks for the kind introduction, and Undersecretary Hirschhorn, nice to see you this morning. I was reflecting as I came here the number of times that I've come to these conferences, and I think you need to give sort of on our badge, maybe we could have a BIS conference pin or something to say how many times we've been here. And I do appreciate the fact that I've been here in different capacities, and I think it's actually a real strength of us, as Matt pointed out, that several of us have had the opportunity to work in different agencies. In fact, I think that's one of the reasons that so much of what we've been able to do over the last couple of years works so well. I usually say that we actually get along really well, which sometimes is interesting when you work with interagency colleagues. But I think the fact that we do and the fact that we're very serious and work collaboratively together is very important. Ann just mentioned that when we think about what we do in the realm of export control, we really do it both from a national security and foreign policy perspective. And obviously, having spent almost 4 years at the Department of State, I understand the importance of the notion of the foreign policy aspects. But what I want to do this morning is just share a little bit, since I'm the only DoD person on the panel. I want to spend a little bit of time this morning just highlighting the role that my agency plays, particularly in the national security aspects of these issues, both focusing on what we do in the interagency process and then also in the international regimes and things which Ann spoke so eloquently about. So first, a little bit about my agency. I'm the director of what's called the Defense Technology Security Administration. It's a field activity that reports to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Ms. Christine Wormuth, in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. My agency is around 220 individuals. We have individuals, civilians, military, and contractor. One of the things that I think is most interesting about our agency is the expertise that we have from a technical perspective. I've got a real cadre of scientists and engineers who really understand technology and the full breadth of technologies. In fact, I'm not allowed to make a joke. It doesn't take a rocket scientist because I have rocket scientists. So one of the things that we do, and it was interesting when I came back to DITSA, because I'm actually a retread. I was the director of this agency before, and I came back, and I'm hoping I do a better job the second go-round, is the fact that that we really had, I kind of thought about what people think about DTSA. And when people think about DTSA, they have a tendency to think that the primary thing that we do is to basically review export licenses, munitions that are staffed to us by the Department of State, and dual-use items that are tasked to us by the Department of Commerce. And that is a lot of what we do. And in fact, we review and give a national security perspective on behalf of the Department of Defense. We're basically the entry point and the exit point for the Department of Defense position. We do about 60,000 licenses a year. So you can imagine that takes up a lot of our bandwidth. But we do an awful lot of other things. And so let me just touch a little bit on a couple of the other things that we do that I think are important. The first thing is the role that we've played in the Export Control Reform Initiative. And I know yesterday, I believe, there was quite a comprehensive explanation of a lot of the aspects of export control reform. But one of the roles that we've played, which again I think is a very important one, is really to help with the very comprehensive review that has been done, particularly of the U.S. munitions list. Again, those technical experts that I mentioned play a very critical role in helping us to determine what technology should stay under the jurisdiction of the Department of State and what items can move over to the jurisdiction of the Commerce Department. It's been an interesting thing, category by category, and of course now we've accomplished, we've actually done we have new rules and regulations out with 15 of the 21 categories. And for those of us who have been in government a long time, we often don't take time to pat ourselves in the back. That's a pretty significant accomplishment. And the one thing that we had to do that was real challenging is to try to get the two regulations be more harmonized. If you're familiar, as many of this audience are, about the commerce regulations, they're very incredibly delineated, whereas the U.S. munitions list was not very well delineated at all. In fact, had a lot of phrases that said military and intelligence use. Well, what is that? So one of the things I think we've played a very fundamental role in is making sure that as we delineated the type of parameters on the U.S. munitions list, that those were well defined. Have we done it quite right? I think we've done it pretty well, but I have to tell you the process that we use in terms of the collaboration across the interagency and then the input that we've gotten from the public comment period as we've done each of the proposed rules has been terrific. Another thing that we've done, and Ann alluded to it a minute ago, is my agency serves as the program manager for the single integrated information technology system for the U.S. government. U.S. exports. And again, I was very pleased when we discussed within the export control reform system, or in the process, the famous four singles, as we called them. And I was very pleased that the Defense Department system, U.S. exports, was chosen, something that I was very familiar with in my previous time at DTSA. And I have to say it's a very good system because it allows us to move the licenses between the agencies and has a very good repository of precedent cases so we can move them quickly. So in the last, I'm pleased to say now, we fully have the Department of State and the Department of Commerce online. And when I say Department of State, it's both for munitions licenses as well now as dual use and military items. Commerce came online a few weeks ago. We have the Department of Energy online, and now we're finishing up and we'll be adding OFAC from the Treasury Department to that process. So I'm very pleased with it. It's been a challenging thing, you can imagine, in this day and age with IT systems being as challenged as they are, to have all the agencies connected. We've done a lot in terms of the adjudication of the licenses between the agencies. We have more work to do, and now we'll move on with making a single portal for the industry and utilization of a more single form to make it easier for the processing of input from our industry. So I think that's all a good news. I also just want to note that DTSA plays a very unique role in the various multilateral regimes as well as the sanctions process that some of my colleagues from State and Treasury will discuss in a few moments. We have always played a very major role in things like the Wassenaar regime in the development of technical proposals, and we've also played a very significant role in support of the technical and licensing aspects of two of the other regimes, in fact, the Missile Technology Control Regime and the Nuclear Suppliers Group. But a few months ago, we were asked if we wanted to take on the policy responsibilities related to the Missile Technology Control Regime and the Nuclear Suppliers Group, and candidly, it was a synergy that we could not resist. And I was very pleased here recently when one of my senior officials was able to participate in the MTCR plenary in Rotterdam. I also just want to mention that we're very much involved in sanctions policy. Ann mentioned a few minutes ago the various sanctions that we put in place and also the limitations on providing capabilities to the Russians. We played a very significant role in that. Obviously, the perspective from the Department of Defense in terms of the type of technologies that the Russians would be wanting to acquire for their military modernization. So we've been very much involved in the development of those specific determinations of what items we should not go to the Russians and what dependency they had on the United States as well as other Western sources. And we've participated actively in talking with other countries, making sure that they aren't the weak link because we're not going to do that. And then finally, also Anne had mentioned the Arms Trade Treaty. Again, my agency has the responsibility for the implementation of that and support of that within the Department of Defense. So that's just a little bit of what we do, and I can tell you that the other role that we play is really the establishment of technology security policy for the Department of Defense, and that's whether items go through the direct commercial sale process or through the foreign military sales process. The final thing I want to end with today is just another area that we're spending a tremendous amount of time on, and I know there are industry officials in the room, and it will be a mix of those in classic defense industry and those that also do both defense and commercial activities. And one of the things that we've been putting a lot of emphasis on in the Department of Defense and actually working with our colleagues, particularly at the State Department and the Commerce Department, is to be doing a lot better in terms of our advocacy for U.S. industry, and also making sure that we work with companies to help them understand the kind of exporting they want to do. One of the things, obviously, that's significantly happening in the defense industry is that as the Department of Defense becomes less of a consumer of those products, the industry themselves are looking for selling more products abroad. And I interact with a lot of the companies, both individual companies through industry associations and through things like participation with when the CEOs of companies come in, particularly to talk to Defense Department officials about support for DoD programs. And I can tell you one thing, most of the industry that I interact with is talking about having somewhere between 30 and 40% of what they sell actually going to those international markets. And in light of that, it's also very imperative that we start working in advance with industry and in partnership, and also, candidly, working with other countries who will be the recipient of that technology. So we do a lot of work both through the various multilateral regimes as well as through various bilateral forums that we have in talking to countries about the importance of protecting technology, not only technology that they receive from the United States, but in many cases the technologies that they're developing indigenously themselves. So in the sake of time and knowing that we always have a very rowdy question and answer session, let me stop at that. So thank you.
So, hi, I'm Brian Nilsson. I think I know pretty much all of you in some capacity and from one of my jobs, and so it's kind of cool to actually be here. And as Matt said, to be here having to realize that I'm sitting in a different chair each time I come because I've changed jobs so many times. But seriously, I'm enthusiastic to be here. This is the beginning of my 4th week at the Department of State at the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, which has been I've been enjoying my first 4 weeks. I will tell you, I feel a little bit like a kid in a candy store where I'm like sort of responsible for some of the mischief that I've made from when I was sitting at the NSC. Terrific team of people. I want to hats off to Tony Dirth, who has been acting in the job. As you guys know, he is the Director of Defense Trade Controls, the licensing office. And so I will tell you that the transition has so far gone seamlessly, both from my move from the NSC and state's acceptance of me, which is terrific. For those of you who don't know, as I rotated out from NSC, my replacement there is Patricia Peterson, Pat Peterson. Many of you may know her from DITSA. So again, yet another example of how the agencies are basically sort of rotating and partnering, which I think is a terrific thing to keep us all in sync. So if you haven't met Pat, I know she was here yesterday, and if you see her, please reach out. She's assumed the mantle of sort of the ECR chair for the White House. And so if you haven't met her, please make an effort to do so as you see her. The other issues that I think we could talk about a little bit is that, as Kevin already talked about, I think in quite detail yesterday, export control reform, the beat goes on. I think Kevin's given you a pretty robust readout of where we are on the rules. Category 12 is challenging. We're looking at doing a second proposed rule. We've already gone through the public comments and are starting to review categories 14 and 18, which went out and proposed. We are also nearing putting out proposed rules for the first re-review of categories 8 and 19. Those are the first categories that went final 2 years ago, 2 weeks ago. So, and then we're also working through the harmonization rule for the definitions, and so we're also getting closer on that as well. So those are key priorities. These have been hard categories. We intentionally left category 12 to last. That was one of the categories that by design we agreed in the early days to leave it to last, just because there'd been so much difficulty in that category, and there was an interagency disagreement for a long time. So I think that we have come a long way since in the last 6 years in kind of working together as a team and working toward what we need to do for revising these controls. So. And then I think Kevin also talked yesterday about the idea that we're looking into for the potential of writing a common set of regulations. One of the challenges that we've got is that, and we actually found this as we were developing the licensing policies for license exception STA, is that the EAR has, hundreds of pages and looking through and as we were trying to determine some of the country groups that had basically conveyed from the old regs to the new regs in the mid-90s, we sort of lost the institutional memory for why some of those groups were there, why those country groups were there. There's still 67 different country groups in those rules. And it was going to take us another 6 years just to open those regs, to go through, to reconcile what is it should we be doing. And so the idea is that the ITAR, one of the advantages of the ITAR over the EAR, see I can say that now from the State Department, is that it's a lot shorter. And actually what we're looking at is that while we're not quite ready for any phase 3 legislation, we could look at writing a common set of regulations. We would have to publish it under 2 different titles because we're operating under different authorities. Where we would actually be able to take the harmonized, the rewritten list and take in the key harmonized terms that we're now approaching that point and writing a common set of regulations basically from scratch. Now, this is obviously going to be a science project. It's going to be a big deal to be able to do that and very labor intensive, but we think that may be the better approach than having to open up the EAR and going through that other process. We think it would probably be a better way to go about it. I will tell you that DTC has taken ownership of doing that, and so we're the ones exploring doing it, and so actually getting somebody in place that would be able to do that. So that's a work in progress. Other things I will tell you from the DTC perspective is that I think that people, I guess a lot of people don't realize sort of how DTC is structured, how it relates to the rest of the State Department. I mean, we are a large directorate within the largest directorate within the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, and people don't realize that it's really basically an agency in and of itself. I mean, it's sort of a separate entity within the Paul Mill family, and so we have as part of ECR, there's been a consolidation and a reorg within DTC, which was implemented in July of last year. So there's actually 4 offices. You've got licensing, which is now revised and consolidated some of the licensing divisions, and that's under Tony Dirth, to reflect the changes in the shift of items from state to commerce. We have a compliance group, which is headed by Sue Gaynor. We also have a policy shop that's also somewhat of a new invention that historically used to be just a regulations branch, but we actually have created a policy shop within there, and I'll come back to why we did that in a minute. And then we also have and that's headed by Ed Peartree, who many of you probably know. And then the 4th office is our management directorate, and so that's led by Lisa Guerres. And so we have a much better structure as going forward. So what we're planning on doing now and what we've started doing is that much of ECR has focused on moving things away from DTC. And so ECR has, in part because as the idea of prioritizing our controls, I used to joke, the way it historically has worked is like Lucy and Ethel on the production line, where licenses are coming in, everything's treated the same, we're processing everything, and so it's overwhelming. And And so by prioritizing what we control and keeping the most sensitive items, those that provide the United States with the critical military intelligence advantage, we would keep those on the munitions list. And so for the less sensitive military items, we would move them to commerce. We would avail ourselves of more flexible legal authorities, and so we would allow things to go without necessarily having them coming into that production line process, so that we can treat allies like allies and where we can focus our resources better. But there hasn't been a lot of discussion to date about, DDC is at the core of all of this because we're the ones that control the most sensitive items. And so I can tell you that there are a number of things that have always been on the work plan for reforms for how we would revise and enhance how DDC does business, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. So simply because of the complexity of rewriting the list and then moving stuff to the commerce list and then making any necessary adjustments, we realize that this is the most comprehensive overhaul we've ever done. I always say it since President Kennedy, and then Kevin Wolf always corrects me, says Thomas Jefferson. But the issue is that we realize that it's introduced a lot of complexity that wasn't there before, and so we're going to work through that to get it right. So I think the public process, doing the proposed rules, which EDC never did before, is really the best way we've found to do that. So I will tell you that just as we're starting now, we're actually sort of doing a comprehensive review internally for how we do business and what is it that we need to be doing, and how can we do it better. As Beth already said, that we've made the transition to moving to U.S. exports for the processing of licenses, but that's only one IT system. One of the things I've been surprised by in-house is that DDDC still is very much a paper-based system where we have it's amazing to me how much paper is on people's desks and how much time it takes. The reason why it takes compliance a long time to get to voluntary disclosures is because there's a huge pile of paper on their desk. And so one of the terrific things they already have in play is that they've hired a CIO who is now doing sort of a comprehensive scrub of all of the other systems within DDDC that need to be overhauled. And so that we can start transitioning toward a truly electronic process, which is going to give us a lot more flexibility and a lot more timeliness in how we do business. But that's just sort of the start of what we're doing. Other things that we're looking at, DDC historically has not always sort of been plugged into the rest of the State Department. It's a little bit of a challenge because we're a regulatory agency, which is a little different for the State Department. And so I mentioned earlier, that in our policy office that we've actually created a sort of a policy team, which is somewhat new. And the reason we've done that is because we're now working toward being more partnered with our other agencies and within the State Department on how policies are being developed. Historically, what's happened is that you may have an incident in a country where decisions are made where we're going to not do this and we'll take the sledgehammer approach. We're going to add them to a country to 126.1, and then boom, we're done. But that's a sledgehammer approach, and so, but the DTC folks are the ones who know what's going on in the defense trade world because they're the ones doing it. They're the ones seeing the licenses. They're the ones partnering with DITSA as they're looking and providing us technical advice. And so by creating a policy shop, we're now in the process of setting up teams. And so, for example, Russia, as the Russians are continuing their activities in Ukraine, we've created a team within DDDC that didn't exist before for folks both from the policy perspective and the licensing perspective, and even what they're seeing on compliance for a Russia team. And so we're actually sort of doing a comprehensive look at, well, what is it that we do with Russia? What have we seen? And that's actually not really happened before. And so we should be doing this across the board in everything that we do. And that's the first step. We actually have a sister agency within the Paul Mill Bureau. It's the Regional Security and Arms Transfer Office, which handles more of the foreign military sales. And they partner, so they do the FMS cases, and they partner with a different part of the Defense Department. And so the two systems the two offices and the two systems haven't always been in sync. And so that's particularly true under ECR, where we're allowing a lot of third country transfers of items under ECR for those items that went through direct commercial sales. But we don't allow that under the foreign military sales, which doesn't make a lot of sense when you think about I'm allowing, again, prioritization of controls, allowing sort of the less sensitive items to flow more freely to allies, but if they bought it through government to government channels, they still have to come in and get an authorization. So that's another project that we're looking at. So what we're doing is by building teams by country and by issue, and then partnering with our sister office and RSAT so that we can actually take a much more whole of government approach to how is our defense trade working, and what are we seeing, and what are the trend lines and stuff for both FMS and through direct commercial sales. And so we're just getting started on this, but I think this is a trend in the right direction. And what it's doing for us is that it's giving our folks an opportunity to participate more at the table in the discussions on technical issues, on licensing and trade issues, that we'll have more of a policy say. And then also it's helping our sister bureaus within the State Department and some of the other departments to have a better feel for what it is that we do, so that we actually are working more of a whole of government approach. So, and then just a number of other things. I mean, DDDC is already doing a lot of outreach and training, and so we're actually working toward now, we're developing sort of a strategic outreach plan. Historically, what we've done is that we've sort of been in a reactive mode where we'll go to things that people invite us to, which is terrific. Love invitations, love to go places, but we need to look to see where is the training and the outreach needed, which is not something we've historically done. And then one other area where we're actually looking at, and we already have it sort of in process, is one of my surprises in working with DTTC from the outside and then now on the inside is that when I look at my sister agencies, when I look at BIS and when I look at OFAC and then look at DTSA who supports us, they all have in-house counsels. They all have, they have a really robust legal review of what we do, and there's nothing that goes out to the regulated community that hasn't gone through their lawyers. And so, I mean, as much as people make fun of lawyers, we need our lawyers, is because we're a regulatory agency, and that helps us ensure consistency in what we do. And so one of the things that we're now exploring is actually, states is actually creating our own general counsel's office inside DDDC. And the reason we're looking into doing that is because while the State Department is structured, there's a separate bureau of the attorneys. Typically they're hired as rotational attorneys like Foreign Service officers. And so given the technical aspects of what we do, we think that it would be helpful to have subject matter attorneys who actually work in DTC who belong to the state legal bureau. And so we're looking into that now. So we think that would be a significant process improvement, just as one example, for how we would be more in line with how BIS and OFAC do their business with consistency. So those are a couple of examples. I'll close by saying that I'm happy to be at DDDC. I think they are a terrific bunch of people. They are eager to do things. They are eager to be plugged in more. I think historically what we've seen is that they haven't been as involved in the working level in a lot of what we've been doing. And I think, and so one of the things we're looking at doing is having them more involved. If somebody's working, if we're working on Category 8, the Category 8, licensing folks within Tony's shop should have a seat at the table, and that isn't how we've always done business. And so it's just a cultural change. And so I think that we're doing a lot of that. They've got great, terrific ideas. They've been terrific with me, helping me as I find my way around. On week 4, I'm still finding my way out. I'm still getting lost in the main State Department and finding offices and where I'm supposed to be. So they've been terrific. And so I would just say my hat's off to them. I think they've done terrific jobs. They've been doing yeoman's work all this time. And so we just say that work with us, help us as we're helping you. We're all toward the same goal of making sure the system works as intended. DDC, there will be a DDC panel that follows this one that Tony and Sue and Sarah Heidema will be speaking on. So I encourage you to come to that. They'll be able to answer all the things that I'm not probably talking about at this point. And with that, I guess I'll close, and just thanks very much for having me here.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I want to thank the Commerce Department and the Bureau of Industry and Security for hosting this conference and inviting OFAC to attend. I also want to thank all of you for attending and participating, and it may not surprise you, I have a whole host of questions already So for being so engaged, because we learn so much from these interactions with all of you, and it really is your compliance and what you do every day that makes our regulations more than just words on paper. They actually implement our sanctions. I've been at OFAC for about 8 years, 8.5 years, and I've been the acting director of OFAC for now about 9 months. And I can tell you I'm learning a lot, and I'm learning a lot from all of you during that time. I know that our interactions with you make us more successful, make our sanctions more successful. I'm not going to go into full detail in the remarks today because I know we have a limited amount of time, and I want to make sure that we get to your questions. But there are a few things I should start out with. The importance of interaction with the private sector remains one of our top priorities. That's why we come to fora like this one to engage and hear from all of you. We get about 100,000 phone calls every year to our various compliance and licensing hotlines. Our website got over 2 million hits last year. I think it's 2.2 million hits, visitors coming to our website to learn. And we continue to publish what we call FAQs, or frequently asked questions, to respond to the questions that we get over and over again from the private sector. We've published about 450 FAQs on various topics over the past few years to make sure that we can be as responsive as we can be to the questions that you're asking. But we recognize that our sanctions are sometimes increasingly complex. The Iran and Russia examples come to the forefront in mind in talking about the complexity, and the complexity is there for a reason. Sometimes we can roll out the standard sanctions program, the same type of targeted sanctions program you may see in the past, but sometimes it's more important for us to be able to pinpoint and target certain sectors of an economy or certain actors within that economy, and we recognize that in doing so, it may make your jobs slightly tougher in the implementation and the understanding of our sanctions. And for that, I apologize, but I think it's important for our sanctions to be as effective as possible while minimizing disruption to the private sector and to U.S. and our allied interests. Matt referenced some of our priority programs today, Iran, Cuba, and Russia, Ukraine. In the interests of time, I'm going to just talk about Iran today because I have a number of questions on a variety of programs that I want to make sure to hit at the end of the time. We spent a lot of time at OFAC and across the U.S. government working on the Iran program. We believe that sanctions and our tough implementation and enforcement of our Iran sanctions are what led Iran to the negotiating table and ultimately to the successful negotiation and conclusion of a joint comprehensive plan of action, or as we bureaucrats like to say, the JCPOA, and you'll hear that term from us a lot. Sanctions were among the critical tools in reaching that deal, and we will relieve nuclear-related secondary sanctions on what's being called Implementation Day. That's a term you should remember. But Implementation Day only comes subject to verification by the International Atomic Energy Agency that Iran has taken its agreed steps with respect to its nuclear program. All of our current sanctions, however, remain in place until Implementation Day, except for those that we released and we relieved a few years ago under what was called the interim deal, the Joint Plan of Action, the JPOA versus the JCPOA. The timeline for reaching Implementation Day is not up to us. I can't give you a date because it's up to Iran. Iran has to take its agreed steps, and the IAEA needs to verify before we will relieve any of our sanctions. So Iran, as we say, is not yet open for business. If there's one thing you remember from OFAC today, that should be the line. Our primary embargo will remain even after Implementation Day. That's the other thing to remember. There's been a lot of confusion about what the JCPOA means, and that's primarily relief from nuclear-related secondary sanctions. When we use the term secondary sanctions, what we're referring to is those sanctions that have been placed on third country actors that say, if you engage in certain transactions with Iran, you may be cut off from being able to deal or any business with the United States. That's the primary scope of a relief that will come under the JCPOA. All of the rest of the U.S. embargo will remain in place with a few limited exceptions. meaning that U.S. persons, individuals, and entities will largely remain prohibited from dealing with Iran even after implementation day of the JCPOA. There will only be 3 areas of relief under the JCPOA that will affect U.S. persons. Now, that's 3 areas of relief beyond what we already have today, and I always want to remind people that we do allow exports and other transactions involving permissible areas of trade such as food, medicine, medical products, agricultural commodities, internet and connectivity services, telecommunication services, those that fit our national security and foreign policy goals. But the 3 areas of relief that you'll see under the JCPOA will be, for U.S. persons, will be as follows. First, a general license for the import of certain foodstuffs and carpets from Iran. Second, a general license for subsidiaries of U.S. companies located abroad to engage in transactions with Iran. And third, a specific licensing policy from OFAC for the export of civilian aircraft and parts to Iran. Again, let me apologize for using some bureaucratic terms, and let me explain what they mean. When I say a general license, it's similar to what I think you may be used to from the Commerce Department with a license exception. That means we put in place a regulation that says if you meet certain criteria, you can engage in these activities. So we will have general licenses for the first 2 of those categories and a specific licensing process, meaning that you'll come to OFAC on the last category, the aircraft parts and aircraft to Iran. Our other sanctions will remain in place even after the JCPOA. That means Iran's support for terrorism, its destabilizing activities in the region, and its human rights abuses. Many major companies and a few banks that will remain on our SDN list and remain subject to secondary sanctions. And should Iran violate its commitments, we are prepared to quickly snap back the sanctions. What I mean by that is that we will reimpose the sanctions. That does not mean that we will retroactively make sanctionable what was a permitted transaction. But what it does mean is that we will prohibit any further engagement under the transaction or contract that was entered into. So we always advise companies, and individuals, and entities to be aware of snapback and to be ready for it because it may happen. We don't want to see it, but if Iran violates its commitments, we will quickly snap back those sanctions. And the last thing I'll say on the Iran front and the JCPOA is we are committed to providing guidance even before implementation day. We don't want that day to come and U.S. companies not to know what the future holds. So we're committing to you to do something that I don't think we've ever done before. We're going to provide detailed guidance, including what we call the frequently asked questions and FAQs, even before that day arrives. So stay tuned. I can't give you much more details today, as a few of the questions I'll disappoint on in answering. But what I can tell you is we will provide that guidance prior to implementation day. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you all again for coming today and participating, thanking our Commerce colleagues for hosting this, and I'll be ready to take the host of questions that I've received already. Thanks so much.
I'd like to thank Undersecretary Hirschhorn and the Commerce Department for inviting me to be here today. As Matt mentioned, this is the first time that the Department, or the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs at the Department of State has been represented on this panel. So I'm pleased to be here as the newbie. I think it's fair to say that within the U.S. government, this conference really has the reputation of being one of the most important export-focused events of the year. So it's really a pleasure to be here talking to all of you. I think given that I'm the last speaker on a long panel, and we obviously want to leave time for Q&A, I'm going to focus the bulk of my remarks on just giving you a sense of who we are and what we do with regard to the sanctions and export control functions in the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs at State, or as I'll refer to it as EB. I hope many of you are familiar with the threat finance and sanctions team in EB. For those of you who are not, let me give you a brief introduction. We are comprised of two offices. The first is the Office of Economic Sanctions, Policy and Implementation, or SPI in bureaucratic lingo. The second is the Office of Threat Finance Countermeasures, or TFC. And basically what our teams do is we work to develop and implement sanctions and threat finance policies and make sure that they're aligned with and advancing our foreign policy. I think colloquially many of you who have worked with us may think of us as the State Department's liaison to OFAC, which we are, I think, to a certain extent, but our relationship is much broader and deeper than that, and we, of course, work very closely with BIS at Commerce as well. As I mentioned, we're embedded in the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs, and that's the component of the State Department that has the lead for engaging with the private sector. So we do an incredible amount of outreach to the private sector, both here in the United States. We are also often on the road discussing our sanctions and export policies with foreign governments, as well as with the private sector abroad. And we do our best and want to obviously be closely linked up with both BIS and OFAC in this aspect of our international outreach as well. And finally, I'd just say it's not an accident that we are located within the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs at State. I think it is really a recognition of the relevance and the importance that the private sector plays with regard to implementation of our sanctions and export policies. As John mentioned, you guys are absolutely critical to making these things work. So I want to recognize that as well, and also recognize the burden that it places on all of your shoulders. So thank you for all of the work that you do from a compliance perspective. Now that you know a little bit more about who we are, I'll also very briefly explain how we fit into the world of export controls. And I think maybe the best way to do that is giving you a few illustrative examples. When you submit a license application to OFAC and hear that it has gone to the State Department for review, we are the office on the receiving end of the referral. We work closely with our counterparts in the regional and other cross-cutting functional offices within the State Department to coordinate a State Department position, which we then get back to OFAC with our foreign policy guidance. Notably, in the world of humanitarian-related exports, our office spearheads the review of TISRA license requests for Sudan and Iran, referred to the State Department by OFAC. In the case of BIS, as you know, all license requests submitted to BIS go through a standard process of interagency approval. My office leads states' review of certain categories of exports, including those that are controlled either for crime control or anti-terrorism purposes. And we also shepherd the review of applications for exports to North Korea, Sudan, Iran, and Cuba. I'd say between the referrals that we receive from BIS and from OFAC, we probably process in the several thousands of foreign policy guidance requests a year. Similarly, on an internal basis within the State Department, we work closely with Anne's team and other colleagues in the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation to evaluate more sensitive export license requests to the destinations that I mentioned earlier, Sudan, Syria, Cuba, and North Korea. And I also want to highlight that we take an active and leading role in the development of many of the regulatory changes that are stood up by OFAC and BIS. These can be more targeted measures, for example, whether we're talking about the general license for personal communication devices for Iran, or broader cross-cutting changes such as those that have been introduced by OFAC and BIS with respect to Cuba in both January and September. Given the time, I will also just say briefly on a more substantive note that we handle about over 20 sanctions programs, economic sanctions programs on behalf of the Department of State, including the big ones that you've heard others here talking about, Iran, Cuba, and Syria. I'll just mention a few things briefly with each of those so you have a sense of our perspective. On Iran, I think John covered it very well. I would just reiterate that there is an incredible amount of work going on in the interagency to prepare for implementation day. We know, obviously, that the heart of the Iran deal is that Iran will satisfy certain key nuclear-related commitments, and in return for that, and once the IAEA verifies that Iran has done so, the United States is committed to providing the sanctions relief that we signed up to on the deal. Moving again very quickly, for Russia, I will just mention that we still have 3 baskets of sanctions in force against Russia. The first are targeted sanctions that OFAC has implemented with regard to certain actors in Ukraine and certain cronies of President Putin. The second relates to financial restrictions and certain technological and service restrictions in the finance, defense, and energy sectors of Russia. And the third is a prohibition on exports to, imports from, and investment in Crimea. And I'll just say, so you have a sense of where these things are going, I suspect many of you and the companies you represent are most interested in the sectoral sanctions targeting the finance, defense, and energy sectors. We have linked any rollback of those sanctions to full implementation of the Minsk agreement by the Russians, including restoration of control of the border in eastern Ukraine to the Ukrainian government. I won't belabor this, but we simply have not seen anywhere near full implementation at this point. So you should not expect any rollback until that happens. With regard to our Crimea set of sanctions, we have made clear that those sanctions will not be lifted while Russia continues to illegally occupy Crimea. And then finally, I'll just mention very briefly on Cuba. Obviously, things have changed dramatically since the president announced a policy shift in December, which chooses engagement over isolation. I'd like to commend Matt and his team at BIS and John and his team at OFAC for really doing fantastic work in both January and September to give life, regulatory life, to the changes that the president announced. And then I'd also just add that in addition to the changes on the regulatory front, as you've obviously seen, there have been other very significant developments, including the opening of or reopening of embassies and reestablishment of diplomatic relations, the removal of Cuba from the state sponsor of terrorism list, the announcement and first meeting of a joint U.S.-Cuba steering committee, which will be discussing approaches and creating frameworks for how to tackle a range of issues from transportation to information and communication technology to human rights to law enforcement to claims and so on. So I think it will be a very interesting space to watch. With that, I will just say thank you for your time and attention. Thank you again to the Commerce Department for giving me and the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs a chance to be on this panel and speak to you. And I look forward to any of your questions. Thank you.
So thanks to all our panelists. As you can imagine, we have quite a few questions here. So what I thought we'd do maybe is just start, John, take one, and just run down the list, and we'll just keep going as much as we have time for. So John, if you could lead us off, please.
Sure. I'm trying to make sure that I got a cross-section across all programs. An easy top one on is what are the sanctions on Venezuela? One thing to remember about OFAC sanctions programs is sometimes we have trade restrictions or more comprehensive restrictions on dealing with a whole jurisdiction or a government. Sometimes in many of our programs, we may only have what we call targeted sanctions, where we've identified certain individuals and entities that you can't deal with, but you can continue to deal with the government of the jurisdiction. Venezuela is the latter case, the latter category, where the only restrictions in the Venezuela sanctions program remains on the specific individuals and entities that have been identified under that program. In fact, I think it's only individuals that we've identified under that program, meaning that U.S. persons cannot deal with those named individuals that we put on our SDN list, but you can continue to trade with Venezuela, you can continue to trade with the government. It's only the named individuals that remain off limits.
Okay, please describe next steps in the Wassenaar, MTCR, NSG, and Australia group to multilateralize the ECR list changes. We don't have to do anything multilaterally. Most countries do not have a bifurcated system like we do, where we have the munitions in one agency and the dual use in another agency. Most have just one agency that administers their licensing across the board. And so we view that our commerce licensing system is robust and meets all the requirements of the regime. So the fact that things are moving from the munitions list or from DDTC over to the Commerce Department does not change our posture with regard to the multilateral control regimes. We think that our policies and practices are completely consistent with all of them, and we don't have to change anything.
So I have a question that reads, there seems to be an increasing focus on human rights by our European multilateral partners. How does human rights and democracy development fit in with the U.S.'s export regulations and sanctions policy? And I think that is a question that we could probably talk about for a significant amount of time. And in relation to several of our particular programs, we could have a more fruitful discussion if there were the time. What I would say here is just that promoting human rights and democracy is a key aspect of our foreign policy and is a particular aspect of several of our sanctions programs that have been both a focus from the administration's perspective, and I'll just mention also from the Hill perspective. I can, just to list a few, Iran, Venezuela, Syria, certain of our programs in Africa. Of course, with Iran, it's not just human rights. There are a range of issues, as John mentioned earlier in his remarks. So I'll just say, again, human rights and democracy are a core, the promotion of those two are a core goal and component of our foreign policy. And that there's something that we are looking at from a broad perspective at all times, but then depending on the particular circumstances in a certain country where sanctions or export controls are relevant, human rights certainly can play a significant and important factor in the policy basis.
Yes.
Okay, I guess I'm next. I've got one question. Our aerospace company, a Fortune 20, received a GC response on an issue that is precedent-setting and undoes much of BCR for us. Will DDTC begin posting GCs like BIS does so that all companies are held to the same standards? I will tell you that we had discussions about this previously, about whether or not DDTC would be able to do this. And it's an issue that we're looking at again to see, for transparency's sake, that we would do that. So I don't have a good answer for you just yet, but I will say that it's on the list of things that we're looking at. I also would ask that whoever actually provided this question, if they maybe would find me and come talk to me afterwards. I'm happy to talk to you a little more about it.
So I have two questions that are kind of related to U.S. exports. One was related to how many agencies are on it, which ones are online, which ones are still to come, and what's the estimated time and launch date for a single window for license applications. And a related question then related to the license applicant window or portal, what level of computer security is being implemented to protect the information for the portal interface. Let me just say, so right now the agencies we have online, again, are the Department of Defense, the Department of Commerce, and the Department of State, Defense, and Energy. And again, we're working now to finalize the inclusion of Treasury OFAC to that. This whole issue about the thing that we use right now in terms of moving the licenses between the agencies, the backbone of the U.S. exports rests on our SIPRNet site. Because we obviously want to include a combination of obviously proprietary information as well as using a variety of intelligence information that we use to make our decisions. It's good to share that information so that all agencies are sharing the same information we have related to end users or any other derogatory information that we have, so that's very important. I can tell you that over the last week or so, my agency has gone through a very rigorous inspection by the Cyber Command, a Cyber Command readiness inspection. It was a no-notice thing. And I can tell you that all of us in this day and age should be very concerned about cybersecurity. So I can tell you that I'm getting much more IT savvy than I used to be. So the question about, I can tell you that we will be looking very closely at that kind of interface that there'll be from industry, because obviously you all will be very much interested in protecting your proprietary information, and obviously then bringing it into the system where then we will be moving it and utilizing it within a classified environment for U.S. government decision making needs to be worked through. I am not a technical expert, but I can tell you after surviving this Cyber Command readiness inspection, I know a lot more about cybersecurity than I ever did before. So I'll have a better answer when we start to work through it, and I think to the extent to which industry would like to help us with looking through that, I think we'll be getting some input from industry about some advice you have about it, because obviously it's imperative that both government and industry protect this information.
I've got one footnote I'll add to John's answer on Venezuela. I'm sure folks who trade with Venezuela also know that we added Venezuela to our military and user controls in Section 744.21 as a complement, in a sense, to the sanctions that John mentioned. I'm going to telescope two ECR questions. The first is, when are you going to harmonize license exceptions and license exemptions that are in the ITAR? And the other is, what is the timing and process for the annual control list reviews for each category under ECR? On the former, harmonizing license exceptions with license exemptions, I think that would be the type of thing that would be tackled by the single regulation that we were talking about. So that certainly would be high on the list, I think, in that task. And then in terms of reviewing the annual control list, our current plan is to send out notice of inquiries basically 18 months after any particular USML revised category became final, or was published, I should say. And so that's why we've already done the notices on 8 and 19, as Brian mentioned. So the next ones up in the queue will be the vessels, vehicles, and materials that'll be coming up. And we'll just keep running through those as long as we can through the end of the administration, with the expectation that that process will continue, ideally, into the next administration. I think we've probably got time for everybody to do one more each, so maybe we'll go back to John for another one, or consolidation of some, maybe.
That sounds great. And one, maybe I'll add a footnote to Matt's footnote to my remarks and say that I think it's always important for, when we give an answer as OFAC, for you to look at the other agencies that may have relevant jurisdiction. We try to clarify that in licenses, that when we answer a license application, we speak for OFAC. But it is important sometimes to understand that different U.S. government agencies have different equities, and it's important to recognize those. The next question on Iran is, how does Iran relief on sanctions for only non-U.S. persons benefit America and not handicapped U.S. businesses, in particular small businesses that do not have a foreign subsidiary? Seems very unfair to not allow a fair playing field with EU companies who are already in Iran leasing space and having discussions with oil-related projects. I wanted to take this one because it's a question I get all the time, and I probably should just say in a very blunt manner that it's the U.S. government policy to provide a firm message with respect to Iran's support for terrorism, its human rights abuses, and its destabilizing activities in the region. This is not new. We've had very tough, comprehensive Iran sanctions since 1995, so we've been in an unlevel playing field for 2 decades, and it's only recently with some of our secondary sanctions that have been implemented over the past 5 years that we've actually reached out to third countries, foreign countries, and said to them, if you engage with Iran, we're going to cut you off from the United States. So we've gone to what is the secondary sanctions in that way to give a very tough message. But I think the very blunt answer to the question is I think it's not only the administration policy, but it's the congressional view that the United States should retain its very strong message that we do not condone Iran's support for terrorism and other destabilizing activities, and I think that will continue. The fact that some of our allies may remove certain sanctions doesn't change the U.S. government view, but I should also clarify that the European Union and other partners are continuing some of their sanctions on Iran as well, including terrorism sanctions as well as Syria sanctions. So the fact that we're pulling back some of our secondary sanctions doesn't mean that our allies won't continue to retain some of theirs as well. And I'll also just add that I'll be here at the lunchtime as well. For those questions that I don't get, feel free to hit me up at that time. Thanks.
I've got a really interesting one here. How do you envision the role of the multinational corporation in nonproliferation? Other than compliance obligations, do you think multinationals can play a more proactive role in shaping countries' NP nonproliferation commitments, such as leveraging supply chain compliance norms and helping local firms to be aware of compliance responsibility? And then should there be some incentives created for such efforts? I mean, first of all, let me say absolutely, the multinational is key to this. We think all of you are our first line of defense. You know, you hopefully know your customers. You're the ones that are identifying, gee, this payment stream looks funny. Gee, this shipment route doesn't make sense. Maybe this isn't a legitimate export. So absolutely, we rely on you. We rely on you to set a good example, both here in the United States and abroad. Absolutely, supply chain compliance. If your suppliers aren't compliant with export controls, work with them or go and take your business elsewhere. We absolutely see you, like I said, as our first line of defense, as the first line in our non-proliferation efforts. And so, absolutely. You talk about some of the other things here. If you've got ideas, whoever had this question, or if others of you have ideas, yeah, talk to me. We'd love to partner with you to try and improve compliance around the world. As to incentives, I don't know what I can do for you. If you've got something in mind, let me know. But we know, when we look at transactions, and so as I said before, an awful lot of our business is the same companies doing business with the same companies working on similar programs. And that gives us a lot of confidence that you know what you're doing. And the more you bring your concerns to us about, well, we've got this client, and do you know anything about them, or would this be possible? The more we have confidence in you. And so that does affect everything we do. Knowing that you're compliant and out there, trying to stop the proliferators alongside us is very helpful. And so, as I said, if somebody here has ideas, happy to talk to you afterwards.
Just another question about the timing for any potential sanctions relief for Iran under the nuclear deal. As John mentioned, that will occur on what is called Implementation Day under the deal. That's the day that the IAEA will verify that Iran has satisfied all of its key nuclear-related commitments. Also, as John mentioned, that the timing of that day is not within the control of the United States. It's within the control of the Iranians and how quickly they move to satisfy those commitments. We would obviously be happy for them to move quickly and efficiently to do that because that is obviously a key part of the deal from our perspective, which will result in constraining their path to a nuclear bomb. So again, we don't have the control over that timing. It will happen when the IAEA verifies that Iran has satisfied its key nuclear steps. I'll just say, and I don't have a long answer for this, but I got a very important comment and question, which says, "Nice necktie. Have you always been a half Windsor user?" So it's a very complex answer. I will also be here at the lunch and look forward to talking to whoever posed that question. Thank you.
That's great. So I have two questions that are the same questions, so I'll do that one next. And it's like, any progress on reviewing categories 1, 2, and 3 of the USML? And what's our timeline? So as you know, that's firearms, guns, and ammunition. I will tell you that the rules are drafted. We'd originally drafted 6 rules. It would be 3 commerce, 3 state. We've merged them into just 2 rules, 1 commerce, 1 state, but we're not quite ready to move forward with them yet. Our priorities are the harmonization rule and also getting out another proposed rule for Category 12. These are the only 3 categories that have not yet gone out and proposed. Of the 21 categories, we've published proposed rules for 18 of them, so it remains a priority, but we're just not quite there yet. So, but hopefully soon.
So I'm glad that John came today, because obviously OFAC's gotten a lot more questions than the rest of us haven't. And so this question I'll have to read, because if I don't, then I think the answer to the first part of this question would be a no. So it says, "Can you please tell us if one of your goals as director of DITSA is to improve transparency?" And I'd say yes, and if I didn't say that, or if I continued not to read the question, then I would probably be accused of being disingenuous. So it says, "Some of us in the semiconductor industry discovered that DITSA will not approve license applications for the export of MMICs if the devices are used for AESA military radars in non-US countries. If this is a DoD DITSA policy," and that's underlined, "I suggest you publish it so that exporters do not waste valuable time applying for applications or submitting license applications." So this is a good example of an area where I think the process that we've utilized so far as part of export control reform has its positives, but also probably has its limitations. And that is, obviously, my agency does bring a national security perspective to the issues that we've talked about, and sometimes that involves very sensitive information. And so we try to, and the regulations that we've put out, try to be clear about particular technologies and why particular technologies need to stay on the ITAR and why we can move others. I think we've done a pretty good job in things, but the military electronics area is probably one of the more complex ones, and we alluded to Category 12. I have to tell you, Category 11 is one of the areas where I think we all collectively, despite having gone through 2 proposed rules of that before we put out the final, recognize there's more clarity that we need to do, and I can assure you that the issue that this particular question has raised is seized right now with discussions between state, commerce, and defense.
Okay, and the last question we'll deal with, excuse me, and I have the same offer for everyone, that questions we didn't get to, you can buttonhole us, because I think most of us will be here at least through lunch. I'm going to telescope 2 questions related to Wassenaar. One is related to Wassenaar proposals, and the other is related to Wassenaar implementation and harmonization. The first question is essentially, what is the review process for agreement of new Wassenaar rules? And the rest of the question, which I don't need to read, is with specific reference to the cybersecurity proposed rule that we put out earlier in the year. The review process typically is we will solicit from our technical advisory committees ideas for proposals for Wassenaar. We at Commerce will look at them and then discuss them with State and Defense. And then in addition to that, Defense typically comes up with proposals, and we have the interagency process that Ann mentioned. Typically it's the end of each calendar year and the beginning of the next calendar year to go forward to Wassenaar with proposals, typically in February or March. And of course, we try as much as we can, especially if it's an additional control or new control, to assess what the impact on industry will be. Excuse me. And generally speaking, I think we get very good information from our advisory committees as well as our internal sources on that. The reason, of course, we did the cybersecurity part of the Wassenaar 13 agreement in proposed form was exactly to solicit more comments. And we, as Kevin said yesterday, we got that in spades, and we appreciate that. But we think we do generally have a good process for making sure we know what impact on industry additional controls would be. The flip question, in a sense, is harmonizing application or interpretation of Wassenaar controls with other Wassenaar members. The specific example asked in this case is an unusual one because it says, for example, in the U.S. chemical and protection suits are ER99, but in Germany they are still 1A004. The more typical question is reverse, which is we typically are accused of applying Wassenaar controls more extensively than other Wassenaar members. But in both cases, if there's an issue, we try to reach out to the relevant Wassenaar members and have bilateral or multilateral discussions with them because we really do want to have harmonized, not only harmonized control lists, of course, that's the purpose of Wassenaar, but harmonized application of those. And it looks like Ann would like to add a little bit to that.
Just one comment I wanted to make. We are not the only country that makes proposals in Wassenaar, and in fact, the cyber proposal was made by another Wassenaar member. There are 41 members. They can all put proposals in the hopper. The process Matt described for U.S. proposals is pretty much the same when other countries submit their proposals. We get these February, March of each year. There's a date certain by which Wassenaar tells us proposals have to be submitted. And when we receive them from other countries, then we do send them to the other agencies and we do send them through the tax. So I just wanted to clarify that we're not the only ones that make proposals, and in fact the cyber rule was not our proposal. It was us reacting to another country's proposal, but it did go through the process Matt described.
Good, thank you, Ann. Well, we apologize that we haven't had time to get through all the questions, but as I said, feel free to try to buttonhole us between now and lunchtime, and thank you all for your attention, and thank the panelists for joining us.